Have you ever heard Catholics or Orthodox Christians claim that evangelicals and Protestants, that our final authority is just our subjective interpretation and understanding? I've been watching a lot of clips of an Orthodox apologist named Jay Dyer, and his conversations with evangelicals and Protestants is basically, he says, well, how do we know what the right interpretation of Scripture is? And then he'll say something like, so when a Protestant says, well, we look at the Scripture, we try to evaluate the Scripture and see what does it actually say, he says, oh, so you're just making your own thinking, your own subjective interpretation is the final standard. Now, if we were to talk to some of these people in the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church has what's called the magisterium. And essentially, the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, they believe that their church was given authority by Jesus Christ to be the infallible interpreters of the Bible. Now, I suspect that if I was to talk to somebody like Jay Dyer or talk to some of these people, then if I were to ask the question, how do I know which church is the church that has the authority to infallibly interpret the Bible? I suspect that we are going to get an explanation or an answer whereby that person is going to use their intellect and their interpretation of things like historical facts, and you might even see them appeal to Scripture. So I imagine that if I was to talk to somebody like Jay Dyer, who is an Orthodox apologist, he might say something like, well, he might appeal to historical information. He might even refer to the Scripture, like many of the Catholics and the Orthodox, they love to talk about how Jesus, he said, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. They might even talk about how the keys were given to Peter. Jay Dyer, I've heard him talk. He talks about how the church was given authority to bind people's consciences. So it's really interesting because they don't allow us Protestants and Baptists or evangelicals, they don't allow us to use our faculty and our fallible interpretational abilities to interpret the Bible, to come to the right understanding of the Bible. But they are going to grant themselves, and they're going to assume that we can use our still fallible faculties of understanding and interpretation of historical facts and Scripture to a degree to determine which church is the true church. And I would say to you, as a Protestant, Baptist, whatever you want to call me, okay, I hold the Protestant principles of sola scriptura and ideas of sola. I would tell you that if you people who are Orthodox and Catholic, if you can use your fallible human understanding to determine which is the true church, to then interpret that, I can use my understanding to interpret the Bible. And see, the truth of the matter is, whether you're a Protestant, a Baptist, or an evangelical, whether you're a Catholic or an Orthodox, you can never escape from the fact that you as an individual have to use your mind and you have to look at information, data, whether it's historical data, which is what Catholics and Orthodox are. Eventually, they try to appeal to prove that their church is the true church, okay? You either have to use it for history or the Bible or both. You can't get away from that. And you see, God gave us a mind and an understanding, and God expects us to use our understanding. And that doesn't mean that our understanding is the final authority, because the final authority is God, and God is going to judge us. And God expects us to use our intellect and our understanding, and He expects us to use our mind to look at the Bible. You know, Jesus rebuked the Pharisees because He said they could look at the sky and they could tell what the weather was going to be like. Okay? Jesus did say, you guys can't understand what the sky is unless you have a group of people who can infallibly interpret the signs of the sky for you. No, He expected them to be able to use their mental faculties to interpret the weather, and he rebukes them and says, you should have known. Basically, they should have known and been able to recognize that Jesus was the Messiah. The Pharisees did not need they didn't need the Sanhedrin or some group that was specially given authority by God to interpret the scriptures to tell them that Jesus was the Messiah. The scriptures were sufficient in themselves for them to know that Jesus was the Messiah. And I would say that today we have the Bible. We don't need a group like the Orthodox Church or the Catholic Church to tell us what all the Bible means and to dispute things. The scriptures themselves are sufficient. They're sufficient for us, and we can sit down and, if we are honest, we can learn and we can understand. We don't need some group. And the fact of the matter is, the Orthodox and the Catholic, they can't even agree on which is the true church. So I, as an outsider of both of those, like when you talk to these people, they're just going to beg the question. They're going to assume that their church is the true church, and then they're going to go back and try to argue using their subjective, fallible interpretation abilities of things like history and whatever. So I think that the Orthodox and the Catholics, they need to drop this accusation of, well, you Protestants are just making your interpretation the final authority. Because when they tell us that their church is the true church, ask them why. And watch them use the same kind of reasoning that we would apply to Scripture. They're just going to apply it to history. So, yeah, don't let Orthodox and Catholics they try to get people. Jay Dyer especially tries to get people with these like, see, gotcha. You Protestants just want to make your own infallible interpretations the final authority. Because you know what? They do the exact same thing. It's just they're not interpreting Scripture. They're interpreting church history so that they can use their fallible interpretation of church history to declare which group is able to, supposedly in their view, infallibly interpret the Scriptures back for us. All right, so don't worry about it. The Bible is sufficient. It's profitable for doctrine, correction, and reproof. And just like the Jews who lived during the time of Jesus, they didn't need somebody to infallibly declare for them that Jesus is the Messiah and the fulfillment of Scripture. We also don't need a group to infallibly interpret the Bible for us.